Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us today. We have a very large attendee list today from around the world, from some of the largest online players to some of the largest financial institutions. Welcome to today's webinar, The Evolution of Money and Biometrics. My name is Peter O'Neill, and I am the president of FindBiometrics and Mobile ID World, and we're just back from the world's hottest FinTech conference, Money2020. Biometrics and identity played a very important role there, and every single keynote speaker not only mentioned but highlighted biometrics. I especially enjoyed the opening day on Sunday dedicated to artificial intelligence. The discussions covered so many innovative areas like IoT, robotics, connected living, autonomous vehicles, and biometrics right in there on the security front. But my favorite sessions were first with Ray Kurzweil, the father of AI, who captivated us all with his talk about our brains, how evolution formed them, and how all of this can help guide the next generation of AI development. And oh, by the way, he now works at Google. And of course, the other session was with the Woz, Steve Wozniak, co-founder of Apple. He's not a big fan of Tesla and is skeptical about blockchain, and it was just a brilliant, broad-reaching overall discussion, thoroughly enjoyable. And don't I take a great selfie? I was also very fortunate to moderate an amazing biometrics panel with Dayon, iVerify, which is owned by Alibaba, BioConnect, who is here with us today, and the GSMA Mobile World Congress with their Mobile Connect initiative. And hopefully we'll see some of the attendees today at the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona, and drop me a message if you're planning on attending. We also did over 20 podcasts with our biometric clients exhibiting at the show. It was a very busy week for us at FindBiometrics and Mobile ID World, and a big thanks to our all-star editorial team who have really made us what we are today. I am also very proud to announce that we have entered into a strategic premier partnership with Money2020. They were the first 4 years ago to recognize the importance of biometrics in financial services, and now we are taking it to the next level, a great fit. With so much going on, be sure to stay on top of all the breaking news by visiting FindBiometrics and our sister site, Mobile ID World. And all this month, all month long, we have been focusing on the evolution of money and biometrics. And we have a lot to cover, so I'm going to jump right in. Please note, to ask a question, just type it into the dialog box in the go-to control panel on the right side of your screens. And please do this at any time. Don't wait until the end, as this will give us an opportunity to manage your questions, and we'll answer some of those at the end, and there will be a lot given the topic today. This webinar will last about 40 minutes in total and will be recorded and available at findbiometrics.com. I would now like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors for their continuing support, BioCatch and BioConnect, and of course, a special thanks to Acuity Market Intelligence and our co-presenter today, Money2020. And to start off our discussions today, I'm so pleased that Maxine Most is providing our industry overview. Max is the principal of Acuity Market Intelligence and is the top analyst in our industry. I always enjoy my discussions with Max. We had several at Money2020. No one else I speak with in our industry gets me fired up like Max. She has that ability to see things well into the future and accurately predict where our industry is heading, what the opportunities are, and where the challenges lay. And I know this to be a fact, having known Max for 16 years, and she has accurately predicted every step of this biometric evolution we are seeing right now. In fact, Max was the very first speaker I ever heard talk about biometrics 16 years ago. And just interestingly, the second speaker I ever heard is also on our panel today. Max will now be providing us with her latest thinking. I am so pleased to introduce the mighty Maxine Most.
Thank you so much, Peter. And good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. Let's jump in. The topic of conversation today is the evolution of money in biometrics, and more specifically, just a brief overview, as Peter said, my current thinking on where we are in terms of biometrics and financial services. For those of you who don't know about Acuity, if there are still those of you who don't know about Acuity, as Peter said, Acuity's been focused on this biometrics and digital identity space for almost 17 years now. And so if you're interested in information, if you're interested in data, there's a lot that's available on the website, so you can visit there later. And hopefully there's some of you on my client list that are out there today. If there are, just want to say hello and thanks for supporting Acuity over the years. Okay, let's jump in. So biometrics and financial services, I've got basically 5 points I want to talk about in rapid succession today, because we're going to obviously want to jump to the panel and get into some great discussions. So I'm going to talk about sort of the offerings, what's happening with the mobile ecosystem in terms of driving demands, what the priorities are for financial services in terms of biometrics, some of the key disruptors at play, and then talk a little bit about sort of the cloud versus on-device. I don't really want to call it a controversy, and I don't really think I want to call it a battle, because I think it's really about the future of the industry and how these two approaches are going to lead us to a new era, which is what I call the rise of the BISPs, Biometric Identity Service Providers. So just to set the stage, I know, particularly at Money2020, because a lot of the companies there are actually new companies, and a lot of the people who are in this FinTech space are relatively young innovators, which is fabulous. But biometrics and financial services have been around for a long time, what I call the pre-biometric smartphone era. There were biometric ATMs in the 80s using fingerprints and irises. We've been using voice recognition in call centers for, what, almost 20 years at least? There's a company called Pay by Touch that started in the early 2000s that was doing in-store payments. We had check cashing solutions, and we also, for at least 15 plus years, we're using facial recognition actually in banking environments, particularly for check cashing fraud, believe it or not. So these technologies have been around in financial services for a long time. Obviously, what's changed now is we have, by my estimates, by the end of this year, almost 2 billion mobile biometric devices in the hands of users across the globe. And so we've seen a fundamental shift in the way we think about financial services and biometrics, which is all about our mobile devices. And we're talking about account access, account management, payments, shopping, fraud monitoring and detection, and even now ATM access via our biometric smartphones. So there's a lot going on in this space that is new. And there's a lot going on in this space that echoes back to what's been happening over the past 20 plus years in the industry. And the other piece that we're seeing as well now is biometrics being embedded in smart cards. I'm not so sure how long that technology is viable, because I think ultimately all the tech is going into our phones, but it's certainly something that is being talked about in terms of really thin sensors being embedded in a smart card. So, as I said, the real transformation here in terms of the way we think about biometrics and financial services is about this mobile ecosystem. And really what's fundamentally happened is that consumer expectations have been radically transformed, by our experience and our sense of immediacy and this technology responsiveness that we're used to, and the ability to take our mobile phone and, interact anywhere, anytime that suits us. So what that means is that if we're going to look at providing services via this ecosystem, particularly in financial services, for organizations that want to provide those services and really reap the rewards of this digital revolution, which is online all the time, anytime, reacting to the customer's desires to do transactions, For me, a lot of that means, online shopping before the holidays at 11 or 12 o'clock at night because I'm a single mom. The customer journey has to be radically improved, and biometrics is an important role to play. And the other piece of this, which I think is equally as important, is this, what we call this omni-channel seamless experience, seamless flow, where you can move from your mobile to your laptop to your tablet to even a kiosk to an in-store experience, and still fundamentally have a unified experience, one where you're not jarred and you have to learn 16 different user interfaces. So this is what's driving a lot of this change. And so what that means for the financial services in terms of biometric priorities, the way I characterize it is three major issues or actions, if you will, or challenges perhaps. Experience, improving the user experience so that we have a positive engagement and we don't have people dropping off. Drop-off rates for interactions on the mobile are still relatively high. Friction. Now, this is an interesting concept because people are constantly talking about this, and I heard a lot of this at Money 2020. We got to eliminate friction. We got to eliminate friction. My argument is we don't want to eliminate friction. We want to eliminate unnecessary friction. We want to provide the requisite level of friction based on the level of security, the level of risk at each decision point in our interaction. So if I'm buying if I just went to London last week, it was my first cashless experience abroad. I used Apple Pay about 80% of the time and my credit card maybe 20%. I got onto the London Tube and was able to use Apple Pay, and that was fine with me. I don't really want a lot of friction when I'm just trying to get on the tube. But if I want to transfer $10,000 out of my bank account to my good friend Peter O'Neill, I want to make sure there's some friction. I don't want to be able to do that, accidentally. So friction's an important component to look at in a comprehensive way. And finally, assurance. We want to have a secure, reliable, and fraud-free interaction. I want to make sure that the organizations that I'm interacting with, that I'm accessing services of, are making sure that I'm safe and no one is trying to hack into my account, and that no one's going to be able to represent me in interacting with my accounts or managing my money, etc.
And Max, I did not receive the money, by the way.
Okay, well, we'll work on that, Peter. Okay, so market disruptors, right? This focus on the customer journey in a way really is a market disruptor. You can go ahead and hit the slide again, Peter, and let the rest of those roll up. This obviously smart devices and the mobile experience is fundamentally changing the way we interact with services across the board, whether it's our in-store retail experience or an online experience. The mainstream of biometrics is, again, as I said, I expect by the end of this year over 2 billion devices, mobile devices with embedded biometrics, and go out to 2022, we're talking over 5 billion devices. That is a number that is just staggering to anybody who's been in the biometrics industry for a while, that we would be talking about a biometric platform of that magnitude. That fundamentally changes the game on every level in terms of biometrics. Obviously, the all too frequent and frightening massive data breaches and instances of financial fraud that are just happening on a near daily basis across the globe. And then the other thing, which I think we also heard a lot about, as Peter mentioned at Money 2020, was the rise and impact of artificial intelligence, machine learning, or neural networks. I mean, these terms are sort of used interchangeably, but basically what it means is that our IT systems are going to get a whole lot smarter. And then finally, and I have my consternations about this, the blockchain. What my understanding of this when I think about the blockchain is really that we're reaching the end of the usefulness, the widespread sort of innate understanding that relational databases are going to solve all of our problems. There are real limitations with the relational databases, and I think we're looking at new models. And I think the biggest issue with relational databases, from my perspective, is that these are databases that were designed to be mined. They weren't designed to be secured. And so I think we're really rethinking the way we manage data and secure data in our IT infrastructures. So just to give you guys a big, a piece of data, this is Acuity's projections for how many mobile biometric smart devices we're going to have. As I said, by the end of 2017, we expect that to exceed 2 billion, and getting out to 2021, 22, we're talking about 5 billion. So this is just going to rock your world if you're interested in biometrics. On-device versus cloud biometrics. Now, again, I'm not going to go into each one of these points, and to me, this is not a controversy. What's interesting here is about the way we structure our IT infrastructures, the way we look at fraud and authentication, and how we balance what sort of interactions and authentication and identification goes on a device level and what goes on in the cloud. And my vision is that these two things are both components of the development of a transformative way in which we think about creating secure IT systems, which is that they become identity-centric. And in some cases, device-based identity is just fine. As I said, when I'm on the tube or I'm going to buy a soda machine, go buy a soda from a vending machine, device-based authentication is fine. If I've linked myself to my device, that's fine. If I'm transferring large amounts of money out of my bank account, I'm not so sure that that's viable. And so, you know, the notion is that we want to think about where, and this goes back to this idea of friction, you know, what is the requisite requirement for a particular type of transaction? How much security do we need? How much complexity do we need in the risk assessment and the fraud assessment for any given transaction? And I think we're going to talk about a lot of this as we go on in this discussion, but I wanted you guys to have this, you know, as part of the slide deck so you could really kind of dive into it. Now, there's a couple different models for biometric authentication, and this goes to what I was talking about. So the on-device model is that we use biometrics to bind ourselves to our devices, and then we use device authentication to conduct our transactions out in the broader space. Now, to me, there's a couple issues with this, and one of which right now is we don't really have a strong binding between individuals and their smartphones, because biometrics are essentially a convenience factor today on our smartphones. They exist on top of a PIN or a password, and there's no provisioning within the device. So I could have 5 different people enroll their fingerprints on my smartphone, and the smartphone wouldn't know which one of us was authenticating any device. So we don't yet have a strong connection between the unique verifiable identity of a human being and the biometric authentication that's happening on a phone. The second one is this BISP, Biometric Identity Service Provider, or cloud-based model, which is where you ought to have a link between the biometric device, the biometric device and the individual. But when you actually want to do something that's higher risk or more complex, you want to send that, you want to have that authentication happening in the cloud independently of the device, so that we're not just relying on a device-based authentication in that broader model. There's another way to do this, which is to sort of embed that biometric, cloud-based biometric authentication within an organization, as opposed to doing it externally, independently of the organization you're dealing with. And there's some pros and cons to this. The biggest con I find is that I think it's really important to disaggregate the storage of biometric data from any other PII. And in this model, you're talking about those databases maybe being a little bit too close for comfort as far as I'm concerned. And then finally, just an example of what I'm talking about with the Biometric Identity Service Provider and why I think this is going to be a fundamental transformation in the marketplace. If you look at the way that the world works today, again, you're linking yourself to your device, you're using biometrics on the device and to authenticate some kind of transaction, but the data around that transaction is still credit card based and based on the existing payment processing infrastructure. And I think what we're going to see is the emergence of these BISPs that sort of disintermediate between the service providers and this payment processing infrastructure and say, hey, look, if I know that this person is who they're supposed to be, if I can verify that I am who I say I am, I don't really need that payment processing infrastructure, because that payment processing infrastructure exists to mitigate card risk. But now we're really not talking about the card, we're really talking about identity. So I think this is a place where we're really going to begin to see some substantial disruption over the next decade in terms of how we think about how we mitigate risk. And this is just, again, one example sort of in payment processing. And if you're interested in more information, there's a white paper called Taming the Authentication Beast that talks about some of these issues. And there's also a report that Acuity's put out on mobile biometrics, which has a ton of data. If you're a data hound, Acuity, if you haven't seen Acuity's research, we're totally data driven. So, you can preview that, visit the website, and there's a ton of other data that's available. And with that, I will thank you and turn it back over to Peter and the panel.
Thank you very, Max. As always, very interesting information that you provide to us. Now I'd like to introduce our three other panelists. Joining us from BioConnect, Bianca Lopes, Chief Identity Officer, and from BioCatch, Frances Zelazny, Vice President. She is that second speaker I mentioned that I heard 16 years ago. I've known her for quite some time. And from Money20, Sanjib Kalita, who is the Chief Marketing Officer. We're going to jump right in. First question to our panel. Everyone on this webinar attended Money20 2 weeks ago in Las Vegas. Biometrics are more prominent than ever. Let me start by asking, what were your personal highlights from the conference, either on the exhibit floor or on the stage? And Sanjib, maybe you could start us off on this one, please, and just give us your sort of overview of what you found quite exciting at the show.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and happy to jump in here. First of all, before I get in, I wanted to thank you and FindBiometrics for our strategic partnership. And I think, one of the highlights for me at Money20 was its continuing growth in terms of new companies, new people, from across industries, geographies, and company types. And Peter, you and I have talked about this, as well. But like, for example, a few years ago, there might have been, 3 biometrics companies or solutions on the exhibit floor, and this year it's like 25. And so, that just speaks to the growth in and interest, of how biometrics impacts the payments and financial services industry. And I think the other thing that it does is it highlights how progress doesn't occur in a vacuum. And so I once again really excited to be working with you and FindBiometrics, an organization that also believes that in order to make progress, we need to engage our ecosystems and to see how we can make the appropriate progress. And so as far as what some of the things that jumped out at me, obviously we mentioned you actually both Peter, you and as well as Maxine mentioned AI and machine learning. So for me personally, I found that very interesting because actually back in over 25 years ago, I used to do research in artificial neural networks, and back then it was it was an interesting science experiment, and I was specifically looking at how do you use artificial neural networks to detect life-threatening arrhythmia. And fast forward to Money20, a couple of weeks ago, and people are applying AI and machine learning to detect fraud, to personalize customer experiences, to help determine how chatbots and even smart speakers work. It was just thinking about science fiction becoming science reality. The next piece that really jumped out at me was blockchain. That this was this is an area that has gotten quite a bit of interest the past few years, and much like Bitcoin, there has been a fair amount of volatility around it. But I think we're at a point where we're seeing the discussions go from proof of concept to rollout, and applications of blockchain in real life. And so be that enterprise, like supply chain, or even consumer types of applications like identity, which actually really dovetails nicely with biometrics. And then finally, looking at ICOs and how can an everyday consumer invest and in some of these types of solutions.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, sorry,
go ahead.
No, and finally, the last thing was security. Well, once again, not to beat a dead horse, but it feels like every other day there's one issue or another with some kind of hacker. And I worked at Citibank for about 10 years, and then Google, and I've been in the startup space. And regardless of industry, regardless of company type, this pain point is only becoming more and more important. So go ahead, Peter. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Sanjib. Francis, can I get your take on what your highlights were from the show, please?
Yeah, so having been in this industry for almost 20 years, it was really amazing to me to see the number of biometric providers on the show floor and the prominence of the discussion on the conference track. I started walking around and taking pictures just to see how many I would end up with, and I think, Sanjib, it was more than 30 booths that had either biometrics or digital identity or authentication or multi-factor authentication somewhere in their signage or in their display. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that probably represents about 1/3 of the show floor. And I think what this really means is that you cannot have a conversation today about payments, about banking, about online commerce without addressing the issue of identity and trust. And as Maxine pointed out, the friction element, because there are, you definitely could have much trust and authentication throughout, but there's always this balance of how much you want to disrupt, quote unquote, the user experience, and when it is appropriate and not appropriate to do so. So actually for me, it was great. I was enthralled, to say the least, with what I saw.
Thanks, Francis. Bianca, what was your take on the show?
It's my third time going to the show. Always just enjoy the brain dates and conversations I get to have with the brilliant people that are all over the world and are increasingly more excited about biometrics. It was our first time as a company sort of having a booth on the trade floor, and that was just really fun. I heard sort of Disneyland for biometrics and people talking about experiencing the technology. So I think we've come a long way from hearing that things were creepy and perhaps not mainstream to seeing a room filled with people. When I look back at even watching your panels, Peter, last year and now, how much more mainstream it is and how you're seeing the banks wanting to understand it and wanting to question status quo, and is FIDO the right way? Is it FIDO not the right way? And I think you're starting to see the industry sort of come together to solve the solution and technology problem. I certainly had some exciting conversations. I got to interview Ralph Hammers from ING, which was a really awesome talk about actually how banking will become a personalized service and identity will be center of it. So lots of exciting things, but excited to talk about all the questions we have ahead.
Very cool. Now I'm gonna move along. Max, we've heard some of your comments on this particular area during your presentation. Finance is the front line of biometric innovation. Where are you seeing the most demand for new biometric solutions in the financial space today, and how are you responding? Francis, could I ask you to start on this one, please?
Sure, thank you, Peter. So I think what we're seeing in the financial space for biometrics is moving past the traditional log-on authentication and looking for ways to provide continuous authentication and trust in a session from login to log out, going back to the friction argument and how do you maintain the integrity of a session after the login, because a lot of the fraud that is seen today actually has nothing to do with the specific authentication. There's a major argument to be made for using biometrics to log on for many, many different reasons, but there's also this concern with what happens after the authentication and how do you combat the techniques that today's fraudsters are using, malware that kicks in after the login, social engineering, phishing, where the user is actually tricked into transferring money to a fraudster. So they're actually doing the fraud to themselves, essentially hurting themselves, robotic activity, and all these other kinds of techniques that very sophisticated fraudsters are doing. So I think this is one of the major challenges. And how do you deal with the fact that through all of the brute force attacks all of the personal data breaches that are happening that result in just a session attack. So I think that the financial world is looking and starving for solutions that will create a seamless experience. As I mentioned before, there are different ways to provide the authentication and strong authentication, but they're starving for ways in which to provide that holy grail, the omni-channel that Maxine is talking about. How does a user or how does a financial institution deal with a user that's calling the call center and wants to validate themselves, and how do they marry that up with activity that's going on in the digital channel? How does somebody coming into a branch experience something that is that makes sense vis-a-vis their other experiences in other channels? And I think tying that all together is the challenge for the financial world today. And I think that there are many different biometrics that can provide different capabilities, the physical ones, face, finger, voice, iris, let's say for the traditional logon authentication, and new technologies like behavioral biometrics to provide the continuous frictionless, if you will, experience. And well, in the P2P world, I just want to point, sorry.
We have to get to that.
I just allow me to point out on the P2P side where there is no logon authentication. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a final comment, because there are experiences where there is no initial authentication to begin with, and the platforms are relying on outside or other means of authentication. So sorry to interrupt.
Thanks, Francis. We got to get to that omni-channel situation that Max was talking about fast, because the cost is so dear to the companies that are faced with this. Now, and Bianca, can I get your take on this question, please? Where are you seeing the most demand for new biometric solutions now?
I think that you see it coming in from different sources in terms of you're starting to see a technology pendulum centralize technology stacks under a CISO. So we've seen interested in understanding, how do I replace an RSA token as an example? It's one that's really common. It's old technology. It's been around for years, and it actually has a direct impact on banks' ability to compete with smaller fintechs and provide, as an example, lending facilities or higher approval limits, which usually require a higher security threshold. So I've seen a lot of interest there, but still it's happening in silos inside of the bank, which I think it's really where we talk about ubiquity. It's really not yet in financial services. Banks have not standardized in their authentication strategy. I often meet 7 people in a good day that they all will say they own authentication, they own biometrics, or they own the identity strategy for the bank. So it's been a bit interesting to see that pendulum swing, but still nonetheless not have a cohesive strategy that I think it's really what we'll need to get to a true omni-channel, or really like, I'm a consumer. I should be able to choose whatever channel I want to interact with the bank, and I should have the same experience or the same authentication parameter, at least to the naked eye, at least to the average consumer. It might be a bunch of really interesting technology happening in the background to make that happen, but to me, it should be seamless.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to move on to the next question. While biometrics are becoming ubiquitous, as you mentioned, Bianca, they're not there yet, but they are moving in that direction. In banking and payments, are there any blind spots in finance where biometric authentication is still needed? And maybe, Bianca, you can continue on here and just give us your thoughts on that, please.
I think the blind spots exist from an industry that still has a lot of room for education. I think that there's still a lot of unknowns in even the way we publish our test results versus real results as it relates to biometrics. There's a lot of inside of a black box. I'm not going to tell you how this really works. I think we're starting to see a change. So when I think about blind spot, I start with like definition, education, understanding. And then I think after that is, how do you choose? Consumers want choice. I think one of the critics that you're starting to see coming out with like the iPhone X is, well, if I'm in the middle of a meeting, maybe I don't want to do a selfie because I'm not supposed to be on my phone. So I think contextual choice as it relates to biometrics is a conversation that is a blind spot still in especially in financial services, you talk to large banks, they go, which one do I choose? Like, what are consumers going to like? And I often have the conversation of saying, well, it's contextual. It matters because maybe in the situation, the consumer is going to want different things. So how are you thinking about this more from a platform approach to the problem, as you need as a bank to become a platform for financial services for your clients, and authentication and identity has to be key to that stack and decision.
Thanks, Bianca. You've raised a very important point. And Sanjib, I'm going to ask you for your input on this as somebody who looks at the market in a much broader view. Do you think that education piece is lacking there? Is it kind of like a blind spot right now for, you know, both end users and companies in the financial services area?
I definitely agree with that. And, you know, it's, you know, as far as blind spots, you know, if you are not, you know, if you think about the average person at a financial institution, you know, they're working on a specific piece of the customer experience or a business experience, and you know, I think that it is that individual just needs to really think about how, you know, what are the security holes, what are the routes of social engineering that someone might take, and you know, and I think that up till this point, you know, that this hasn't necessarily been, you know, the status quo. I mean, just you know, think back, you know, last year, I think that there was a major hack of a retailer, and you know, they went in through the HVAC system. You know, so are you going to ask an HVAC person to think about security? Well, I think we should, and so I think that's why, you know, I think this does need to be looked at very holistically, and you know, I think going in, the assumption shouldn't be that, oh, they don't need to be aware of the issues with security. The assumption should be that they should, and you know, and have the right messaging, the right policies and procedures, and to that effect, I think, you know, that the like a biometric identity service, you know, that can be important in the enterprise context as well as the consumer context.
Very good point.
I think another blind spot, Peter and panel members, like, it's just the sheer fact that convenience will trump security any day, right? The average consumer is just used to, I think we can all agree that Apple has brought biometrics to mainstream. So the average person who uses these banking services and financial services systems and payments, or uses their contactless at the tube, it just expects things to work. So I think that there is this like paradigm or blind spot about what is too secure, where's privacy going to live, and I think that's another blind spot that people don't talk about. How are we building these systems with privacy and triple blind when you look at distributor ledgers to share whatever that data is, and how do you build a hierarchical system that people understand of how much am I giving for how much am I getting when I look at even using biometrics as a way of really granting me access to something that requires a certain level of security. And I certainly still see that as a blind spot as it relates to some of the comments that you just made.
Thanks. And Max, can I get your take on this one, please?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked me, Peter, because I want to jump in on so many things. I think this idea of that Sanjay brought up in terms of looking at a holistic approach to security and organization. This person that got into an HVAC system. I used to say it's great to have biometrics on an ATM on the front end, but if the guy or gal, the person who's in charge of loading the cash in the back end, doesn't have biometric authentication, then you don't really know what's going on. And I think that, you know, what Bianca said about biometrics being, you know, kind of situational, I think that there's biometrics, from my perspective, is situational, environmental, contextual, and personal. And so there's a lot of complexity going on in terms of how biometrics are perceived. And one of the things that I've heard over and over again from financial services folks recently is that they're trying to push biometrics out to the edge. And I think that is a major blind spot. And this goes back to this notion between looking at on-device versus cloud-based, because I think that circles back to this idea of taking an enterprise, a comprehensive enterprise approach to understanding authentication, security, and fraud protection. And so I think we have to really, from my perspective, moving forward as an industry, biometrics needs to stand up and say, biometrics needs to be at the core of security and identification, authentication. We need to be a core part of the IT system. We can't just be relegated to the edge, because when biometrics are relegated to the edge, they don't really, you don't really leverage the full capabilities and value that they can bring to an enterprise, whether it's providing services outward, whether it's, so B2C, or whether it's B2B, or whether it's just internally managing your own enterprise authentication, authorization, security, etc.
Thank you very much. Francis, did you want to add anything into this, please?
So I think that there are two blind spots. Thank you, Peter. Like Max, I guess I always have something to say. So the first blind spot, I think, a major consideration is the onboarding of a person into a system to begin with. So again, back to the problem of all of the data breaches and PII that's out there, it's very easy for somebody to use fake information or stolen information and then attach their identity to it. And I think that that's one massive consideration here. And the second one is another favorite topic of, I think, everybody on this call, which is oftentimes biometrics are just implemented as a convenience factor, as an alternative to PINs and passwords. And that needs to fundamentally change, because as long as you can backdoor it through a PIN or a password, which I think the latest statistic was that it takes a fraudster 10 tries to get into somebody's system, just given the basic structure of these passwords. Then the utility of it ultimately will not go all the way. So these are the two, I think, massive considerations / blind spots that we need to consider.
Thank you very much. We're going to get another question in, and we're getting a lot of questions from the attendees. Again, please feel free to send through a question, and we're starting to organize those now. So we'll move to those after this final question, and that is, biometrics are integrated into multiple payment methods, mobile wallets, multimodal biometric credit cards, naked payment systems, even smart home AI. Will one of these methods win out, become our primary payment method, or are we going to simply see a continuous growing payment ecosystem? And Max, I'm going to ask you to start off on this one, please.
I have an incredibly simple answer to this question, which is yes to the latter. This is going to be, a continuously growing payments ecosystem, and to me, it gets back to the role of biometrics being at the core of identification, authentication, authorization, fraud prevention, so that you can enable any kind of transaction, any kind of situation. Again, going back to that notion of being situational, personal, environmental.
Wonderful. Francis.
So I think that we will see, for many different reasons, the digital channel pick up. I think that what that actually means can be what we see today as online banking. It can also evolve. I think naked payments, as you called it, will pick up. And I think that banks do have, and we've already seen it, are trying to move as much of their activity out of the branch and out of the physical world into the online world. I think call centers are also being challenged with the level of support that it takes to manage multiple people calling. And so all of these things ultimately will have to work together.
Thanks. And Bianca, can I get your take, please?
I actually I agree with the ladies before me, but when I think about payments, I actually think about the role that identity can play in changing payments altogether. So I think it's not, and the connection to that is the fact that biometrics represent, I really only have one voice and one face. So if in the future we all fundamentally believe that data is the new oil and could be the new fiat money, disaggregated data as an actuarian is useless. So if I don't know that that data belongs to me, I can't trade on it. So where I see this going is, how do you build identity as the new fiat money? Like David Birch has said this many times. And I think that that reality is coming to fruition in terms of saying identity is what grants me access to things. And that's what money used to do. Money gets you stuff. So how do we use biometrics in that, which goes back to the two previous points about it can't just be on the authentication layer of the stack. It has to be an attribute inside of that user's identity, whether that's a composition of biometrics, their digital identity, their contextual identity, their actually physical identity like credit cards or driver's license. So I think that biometrics has a unique ability to sort of purify that and say, okay, my face is always my face. So how do I use that as my new form of payment? And that can attach to whatever information I grant to that service provider.
Thank you very much. I'm going to jump to some questions from the attendees. We're getting a lot of questions about some of the new technologies that's entering the market, like augmented reality, AI, wearable technologies, etc., and homes, smart homes. So basically, I guess the question to wrap it into one is, what new technologies are you most excited about as it relates to biometrics and money? And Sanjib, can I ask you to start on this one for us, please?
Sure. So I think what I'm most interested in, and I think Maxine, I mentioned it earlier too, but just sort of a person's data, and how is that used, who has access to it, and are there any user controls, are there any institutional controls on it? I think our view up till this point has been fairly elementary, and I think with new technologies, around like big data, around blockchain, or around biometrics, I think they can cause a fundamental rethinking of that. And sort of even going back to the recent question about how for example, the payments might be changing. If identity is in fact the key for payments, that changes things quite a bit. So I'm personally interested in sort of more of the enterprise data and blockchain and database types of things personally.
Cool. Bianca.
I spoke a bit about it earlier in terms of the unique ability of centralizing data that today lives decentralized in a large enterprise. I think that that's why most people get excited about it. Distributed ledger system, where all your records are in one place. When we look at identity as an industry or as a topic or a strategy, today you have 7 to 14 versions of me inside of an enterprise. So you can have the best deep learning algorithm in the world, but if what you're feeding it is a bunch of garbage in, garbage out, you're going to come to conclusions that are quite scary when you think about it from a perspective of financial services. I think that the interesting area that gets me excited is, I was actually talking to some people on Money2020 about the whole idea that most of us don't like thinking about financial products like your pension plan or your retirement plan. So how do we use things like AR and VR to show people what their future is going to look like? So when you think about bringing sort of this need for mastery and autonomy and allowing someone to experience what a financial services is, and maybe you're going to show them their options, that's super sensitive information and an amazing experience. So the need for knowing that Bianca is Bianca using this VR set becomes highly relevant. And biometrics will have an amazing opportunity to play a role in making that reality.
Thank you very much. Francis, can I get your comments there, please?
Thanks, Peter. So I think what financial institutions are most excited about is the maturation of the industry and how everything is tying together and giving them the ability to create solutions and experiences for their customers that is built on choice. So we see many platforms that support different modalities that all work together interchangeably that create the secure portal in, that provide a continuous platform for protecting the integrity of a session and mapping out really like who people are inside a transaction, and more importantly, upfront before they even enroll. So I think the maturation of the technology and the use cases and really seeing how this technology solves problems is what excites the financial community today.
Wonderful. Max?
So two things. One is what I call do nothing biometrics. I want to be able to pick my smartphone up and have it just recognize me. I don't want to look, I don't have to do anything. I just want to touch the thing. I don't care how it does it. I don't care what it's reading, but I want it to be able to do that. And the other thing from my perspective, which I think we're going to see in the next 18 months, is what I call hardened biometrics on mobile devices, which means I don't get in without my biometrics. There's no PIN or passcode workaround. We're gonna have AFIS quality fingerprint sensors. The technology is gonna get really good. We'll have multi modes, but no biometric, no unlocking the phone.
Wonderful. And I'm going to try and sneak in one final question. And I know we're going a little long here, but we're getting a lot of questions in from the attendees. So I'm just going to try and deal with one more. And that actually is about on server and on device as it wraps around also privacy and security. You know, so it's kind of a broad ranging question, but you know, can these two paradigms exist in harmony? On server, on device. Max, you talked a little bit about it earlier, but I want to try and get some of the other panelists' view on it. And where does privacy fit into all this? And Francis, could I ask you to start us off on this one, please?
Thank you, Peter. So I think that there will be, the jury's still out, I think, in terms of on-device versus cloud. I think there's a big push with the FIDO Alliance to move to adopt on-device. But I think that there are certainly many drivers and requirements that would push for a hybrid situation. I think that there are frameworks, and the European framework around GDPR might be a starting point for how to manage data centrally, and I think that there are many different reasons for one or the other or both in harmony. And back to the on-device for the login versus some way to continuously monitor the integrity of the session. There are things that do happen in the cloud that may or may not be recognizable on the device. I think we'll have to see how that, to create situations where both can live in harmony.
Bianca, can you give us your thoughts here, please?
I think we're going to see a lot of interesting things happening with regulatory when it comes to PSD2 and GDPR, and where biometrics might be used and is starting to be used as an authentication tool for relinquishing data and connecting to third parties. From a non-device versus cloud perspective, I think that consumers will want choice. The same way I enable my Apple ID and I provision my Apple ID in a brand new device that I just bought, and it brings my things from the server. So I think what we need to be talking about is actually a lot more conversations about asymmetric cryptography and what are the triple blind processes that we will be using, instead of having this conversation about whose technology is capable of doing cloud versus on device.
Thank you. Sanjib, you know, as somebody who is outside the pure biometric industry, you know, what's your take on this conversation that's happening?
I think that, you know, well, I think at a high level, I'd agree that consumers will want that choice and you know, to control their privacy and the data, and you know that's also being pushed by regulatory issues, you know, in regulators in the in Europe as well as in the States, and so I think that that's sort of the overall trend. I personally can see how enterprise level controls can accomplish those same types of goals. But I think in the end, if there's some kind of almost like a kill switch at the consumer end, I mean, I think that maybe I could sort of see them working in tandem.
Okay, well, thank you all for your comments. We'll actually be having a further conversation about the cloud part of this in our next webinar on December 6th. And I wanted to take this time to, again, thank our sponsors for their continuing support, BioConnect and BioCatch, and thank you for your time today.